All right, I guess we're beginning. Hi, everybody. Before we start, is there anybody from the NSO group in the audience? Can you raise your hand? Anybody? All right, just checking. So my name is Seth, and I'm here with my colleagues Max and Andrew, and we're part of the Security Research and Response team at Lookout, and we led the team's investigation of what we're going to show you here today. So my background is in analyzing targeted malware attacks, looking at things like infrastructure and threat hunting. Max led the analysis of the Trident iOS exploits and determining the associated vulnerabilities. And Andrew took the lead on analysis of the iOS surveillance software called Pegasus that we'll be talking about today. To start, just want to show a video of what this looks like in action. Here's an iOS device, and we've made a check for some IOCs for Pegasus, and they are not present on the device. We're going to show what the infection looks like on a standard iOS phone. So you get a text message with a link in it, and you click on the link, Safari comes up, and something's going on. What's going on? We don't know. Safari crashes. So load it back up again, and there's no evidence that anybody ever went to a link. But then if we go back to check for the IOCs, they're all there. The device has been completely compromised, remote jailbreak, without any indication that anything happened. So what did happen? That was just an iPhone being hit with the Trident exploits, a collection of 3 zero-day previously exploits that were used to install a live copy of Pegasus surveillance software on the device. So one click on that link is all it takes for your phone to be completely compromised and turned into a surveillance system. And that's Pegasus by the NSO group, which is why I asked before. Anybody is here, please raise your hand. But NSO isn't alone in making this kind of surveillance software. You might have heard of some other software and the companies that make it in this area. So there's FinFisher by Gamma, RCS, DaVinci, Galileo by Hacking Team. And the software is sold as lawful intercept for use by governments, law enforcement agencies performing legally authorized surveillance. So this isn't new. I mean, FBI was doing Magic Lantern back in at least 2000, for example. But it's a more recent development that independent software companies are selling surveillance software to any law enforcement or military organization, including governments with well-known histories full of human rights abuses, who don't hesitate to use this technology against activists, journalists, and human rights workers. So that's a good lead-in to how we ended up with a copy of the Pegasus malware and the Trident exploits it used to install itself. Was it discovered as it was being used to spy on an organized crime ring? Was it discovered when it was being used to track a terrorist threat? Unfortunately, not quite. Meet Ahmed Mansour. He's based in the UAE, and he's known for his work as a human rights defender. He's a recipient of the Martin Ennals Award, sometimes called the Nobel Prize for Human Rights. And he's been arrested and jailed for being supporting a pro-democracy petition in the UAE, and he's banned from travel outside there. On August 10th this year, Mansour received a text message with a link claiming to have information on Emiratis being tortured in state prisons, something that's pretty relevant to the work that he's doing. And he received another text message the next day. But he knew what to do, fortunately. This is not the first time he was targeted, and Citizen Lab, for this reason, calls him the $1 Million Dissident. So not only has he been targeted by Pegasus, in 2012 he was targeted by Hacking Team's RCS. In 2011 he was targeted by Gamma's FinFisher, and he's also been targeted by Extreme Rat and Spynet Rat and NJ Rat. I think those were all 2013. So he gets a lot of this stuff. Somebody out there has it out for him, and they're not afraid of throwing a lot of money at this problem to try to solve it. The Citizen Lab that I just mentioned is a research group at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and it focuses on the intersection of technology and human rights. A little bit of full disclosure, I worked there doing research for 4 years, primarily looking at politically motivated, targeted attacks against human rights organizations and individuals. Mansour has worked previously with researchers at the Citizen Lab, Bill Marczak and John Scott Railton. So when he received those links, he knew what to do, and he sent them to Citizen Lab researchers for analysis. Bill and John wrote a really great report. If you're interested, just do a search for Citizen Lab $1 Million Dissident, and that provides very detailed background, context, and information on the command and control infrastructure used here, and threat actor attribution, where they identified Pegasus and the NSO group as the surveillanceware vendor. The research team at Lookout, we received the link and the initial sample from Citizen Lab, and we worked on a deep dive technical analysis of the vulnerabilities, the exploits, and the Pegasus malware itself. So what did Citizen Lab find, and how did they figure out that this is NSO's Pegasus? You should go read their report, but the quick version is that Bill and John had been working on another report into Stealth Falcon, which is what they call a threat actor targeting many UAE activists and dissidents, including Mansour. So when he received those texts, John and Bill scanned the internet for fingerprints of specific behaviors of the command and control domain, and they found over 200 matching IPs. They found related domains, and using a collection of techniques on that public information, they linked those domains back to two hosts on the NSO group's network. Looks like a mail server and a QA domain. So it turns out that what Citizen Lab was doing, before they even knew it, they were mapping out NSO's mobile attack infrastructure. And they found through it evidence of related targeted attacks in Mexico and in Kenya. How do they figure out that this is actually Pegasus? Well, it uses Pegasus in the software itself to describe itself, and the sophistication and capabilities are consistent with information released from the hacking team leak. So we're pretty sure that this is the real deal. As for the actor attribution, who is Stealth Falcon? Who is using NSO's malware to target Mansour? Who would be targeting him, and who would have the money to throw at the problem? So Stealth Falcon has targeted other Emirati dissidents and critics. They counted 27 people attacked over Twitter, of whom 24 are directly related to the UAE. Of those people, 6 of them were either arrested by the UAE government or targeted for arrest and convicted in absentia. Here's a collection of the words that they've used in their tweets and links to malware. Those topics are pretty interesting if you are an Emirati dissident or critic. So take a look at Citizen Lab's report on Stealth Falcon. It's got much more information, and so if you're not able to connect the dots here, you should read their report for a clearer picture on who the threat actor likely is. So with the background on how we found this, let's talk about Pegasus. What is it? The simple answer is that it's high-quality espionage software that's used for complete surveillance of a device. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking here in functionality, just the way they do it, the sophistication and the quality. This should all be familiar if you know about other malware, such as RCS or FinFisher. It's everything from stealing your data to activating the camera, taking video, activating the microphone, and listening in on you remotely without any indication that anything is happening. And Andrew will talk more about Pegasus and its specific capabilities later. I just want to highlight that normally this surveillance isn't possible on iOS. The sandbox is supposed to prevent any app from looking at other apps' data or for accessing hardware in a low-level way. So in order for Pegasus to work, it needs to first jailbreak the device. This is where there's a big change from previous analysis of surveillance software. The attack uses 3 exploits in a chain, which we call Trident, which gives Pegasus complete control of the device as well as persistence on the device. How that operates, a single-use link, like mentioned previously, will exploit a Safari use after free bug. Once on the device, a kernel info leak bypasses KSLR, and a kernel use after free will compromise the phone. You get a full remote jailbreak. The last stage is installing the surveillance software, Pegasus itself, and setting the device up so that it is re-jailbroken on reboot. And Max will talk about this in much more detail later on. Looking at the exploit chain, these are the CVEs, and we worked with Citizen Lab and Apple to responsibly disclose the vulnerabilities. Of course, we burned them, and work with them as they created the 9.3.5 iOS release in just 10 days, which is a really, really short amount of time given the huge amount of work that it goes into making a new iOS release. The amount of testing, the amount of verification of the bugs without introducing new bugs. 10 days is amazing. So this is how it should be done, and thank you very much to Apple for that. Just to round out the introduction, here's a partial list of apps that Pegasus targets for stealing data from. And I'm really hoping that this doesn't sound like an advertisement for Pegasus. Like, seriously, governments out there, if you're listening, don't buy from them. They're jerks who sell to oppressive regimes targeting human rights activists. Like, how much worse can you get? But this really is a comprehensive list of apps for stealing data from. Like, look at that, it's everything that you use. Andrew will talk more later about how Pegasus steals data from these apps. But for now, what you're probably here for are the iOS vulnerabilities and exploits. So I'll hand it over to Max to talk about that.
Thanks, Ted. Let's move to the technical analysis of Pegasus. As we say, the Pegasus uses 3 stages and exploits Trident vulnerabilities on each stage. On the first stage, it uses CV4657, which is Safari WebKit remote code execution. Then it jumps to stage number 2, which is CV4655, 4656. One is memory info leak to bypass the Kaiser, and 4656 is a warrant-to-use kernel-level code execution. And finally, jump to stage 3, that install espionage software and use special trick to run unsigned code execution and achieve a jailbreak persistence. So I will check each stage more detailed. So first stage, as I said, contains a single-use spearfish URL that will be invalidated after a first click. And it contains obfuscated JavaScript. This JavaScript checks for device type, is it iPhone, is it iPad, check for processor type, 64-32-bit, and based it on this information, it downloads different types of stage 2. And of course, it's use a remote code execution vulnerability in a WebKit by downloading a shellcode from a stage 2 and overwrite it in a readable, writable, executable segment. I will check it in detail. So CV used 4657, remote code execution in a WebKit. It exploits use of the free vulnerability that's specially crafted by using 2 bugs. And exploit that we see it's not that stable as it relies on a WebKit garbage collector. So how it works? The problem exists in a slow append method of the market argument buffer. And it can be exploited by using a slow append in define properties method. So define properties is a method that can be used to define or modify properties directly on an object. It uses a few arguments. One is the object that will be used for modifying or adding a properties, and actually the properties object, which all enumerable properties constitute a descriptors for properties to be defined or modified. It uses pretty simple algorithm containing 2 loops. On the first loop, it checks for proper formatting of each of the property descriptors. And if it's okay, it will be appended to a property descriptors vector. And to make sure this reference to property descriptor not become stale, the market argument buffer mechanism is used that makes sure this reference will be not deallocated during the next garbage collector cycle. And here is the second loop. So the second loop running after each property descriptor has been validated. And it uses a define all property method to associate user-defined property with the target object. And here's the problem here, because define all property may be used to call user-defined method. And if in one of these user-defined methods the garbage collector cycle will be triggered, it may lead to any unreferenced object on a heap to be deallocated. To more deeply understand the problem, let's check how the market argument buffer works. So first of all, a few words about the JavaScript core garbage collector. The garbage collector is responsible for deallocating objects from a heap that are no longer referenced, and it's running on a like different time spots. It depends on the memory pressure and depends on a device type. So basically, what it's doing is it's walking through a market argument buffer stack. and check is object have any references. Object reference also may exist on application heap. In this case, slow append will be used, the alternate method. So market argument buffer use stack to keep track of object, but starting from the 9th object will be appended to a market argument buffer, it will move to a heap. And here is another problem that running a slow append will expand a capacity, and as we see on the code on the right, when m size will be more or equal to m capacity, slow append will be used. So the problem here is it will be running just once, because m capacity will be expanded. I will show it more detailed. So the slow append. The first thing it is doing is moving all the objects from a stack to a heap. And after that move, objects are not automatically protected from a garbage collector. To make sure they will be not deallocated, the special heaps mechanism mark list set is used. To make that, the heap context acquired and it's added to a mark list set. And here's the problem here, as we see, if there is not possible to acquire a heap context, it will be not added to a mark list set. And how the heap context may be acquired? It's called a heap method on a heap class. And the very first thing it's doing is checking is the underlying object is a JS cell. For this, isCell is used and it's checking for underlying object tag. For a cells, it will be a cell tag, but for primitive types like Boolean, integers, the underlying tag will be different. It's not a cell, so isCell will return false, and the heap context will return false. That means we cannot acquire a heap context for primitive values. And once again, the problem in append, the slow append will be called just once, only when m size will be equal to m capacity. After that, m capacity will be expanded. How we can use all this information? So first of all, we can append more than 8 values to market argument buffer to force it to move from a stack-based buffer to a heap. And if the 9th value will be a primitive type, like a Boolean or integer, it will be not added to a mark list set. And the problem that all the subsequent values will be not added to a mark list set. That leads that all values on a heap will be not automatically protected from a garbage collector. If somehow we can trigger a user-defined method that remove JavaScript references to this object will be deallocated. So let's exploit all this information. In order to achieve arbitrary code execution, exploit use a specified properties object that contain 12 properties. So first 9 properties have a simple type, a number type, and it will force market argument buffer to move from a stack to a heap. And as we see, the P8 property, it's a simple type. It will trigger a bug in a market argument buffer. The values, this value and all the corresponding values will be not marked. So that leads it not number and array will be not protected by garbage collector. And when define on properties method will be walking through the props and trying to convert not number object to a number, it will call the user defined toString that we see on the right. What does the toString is doing? It remove the JavaScript reference to array object and try to call the garbage collector by allocating a large amount of memory. This will trigger a garbage collector that will deallocate the array object from a heap. And the very last thing it is doing, try to make a new allocation to overlap the new JS array object on a stale one. So using this special crafted useafterfree and the shellcode from a stage 2, the Pegasus allowed to run a kernel exploit that I will talk next. So stage 2 contains a payload which is a shellcode and a compressed data. The shellcode uses for kernel exploitation in a Safari context. And the compressed data is just a loader that downloads and decrypts stage 3 and the configuration file which contain addresses and decryption keys. One of the CVs used is a 4655, is InfoLeak that can be used to bypass the KSLR by leaking kernel addresses. The problem here is that there are missing bound checking in a OS number constructor and OS unserialized binary, which leads that attacker can create OS number object with a high number of bits and trigger it from IO registry entry get property bytes. And unfortunately, it can be triggered within the application sandbox. Let's check the problem more detailed. So IOS serialized binary is a method to handle binary serialized data. It converts a binary format to a basic kernel data object. It supports different container types like arrays, dictionary sets, object types, numbers, strings, booleans. And the point of interest in here is OS number. So as we see, the OS number constructor got called without any input values validation. So just OS number with number call. What it's doing, it's call a designated constructor OS number init, again without any checks for a length property. And finally, init. So init blindly trusts all the input arguments to a method and override one of the object fields with new number of bits in this case. The problem that the size variable will be overwritten, and this size variable will be used in the other methods of the same object. In this case, for example, number of bytes, which leads that return value of number of bytes fully controlled by attacker, because we control a size. How it can be used? Let's check who is running the number of bytes. Unfortunately, are you register enter get property bytes? It's a code that's handling OS numbers, and unfortunately, it uses stack-based buffer to handle OS numbers and then copy it from a stack kernel memory to a buffer, to a heap buffer, and return to userland. And for that, the bcopy is used. But as we see, the bcopy uses a len that got calculated from number of bytes, and we control the number of bytes, which leads that attacker can control how many bytes can be copied from a kernel stack memory and returned to userland. How we can call it? First of all, let's check how IO register enter get property bytes can be used. It's not that hard because IO register enter get property can be called from a userland and can be called even from an application sandbox. So this is how exploit may look like. So first of all, we create OS dictionary object that contain OS number with height number of bits as a key and as a value and one of the property as a key. The next thing we do in IO service open extended. It will spawn a user client, and next we can call IO register enter get properties on this user client. So this will trigger vulnerability. And as we see the data buffer variable here, the 256 bytes of the kernel stack memory will be copied and returned as a data buffer. The last step here is determine kernel base address from this stack memory, which we have here. So after we get a kernel base address, we can jump to the next attack, which is CV4656. It's user-free to gain kernel level code execution. It exploits the problem that set@index macro does not retain an object or doing any other memory management. The trigger happens in our friend IOS serialized binary, and again, unfortunately, can be triggered within the application sandbox. So IOS serialized binary, we just check it in a previous bug. So it's a method that parses binary encoded values and return the IOS object. Support different container type like dictionary sets, arrays, object types, numbers, symbols. And here is a very special case called the KIOS serialized object. It allows us to create a reference to already deserialized object. This is important, and we will go for that next. So in the process of deserializing and parsing object, IOS serialized binary create an object and keep track of all the objects by using set@index. What does set@index do? It uses objects array to keep track of objects, and it just saves a pointer to the serialized object as one of the array indexes. And here is a big problem here, because it doesn't retain an object or do any other memory management mechanism, just save a pointer. And unfortunately, what's going next in a code that casting OS string to OS symbol, we call a release on object pointer, which will lead to object deallocation. So the object is deallocated, but the object's array still have a reference to it. If you can somehow use it, it will be used after free. And here's our friend KIOS serialized object that will call retain on an object that is saved in array. So basically, object is deallocated, array still have a pointer to it, and we call retain on this pointer. It's classic use after free. How we can exploit it? First of all, let's create a OS serialized dictionary that will contain OS string that will lead the object deallocation. And as this OS string object is 32 bytes in the memory, we need to do the next allocation to reallocate our attacker-controlled object. For this purpose, OS data is a perfect candidate. OS data can be pointing to a buffer. We can control the buffer size. We can control the buffer content. So what we're doing, we create a buffer size with the same size as OS string object. And this buffer will contain fake OS string object with fake vtable. The very last thing is to trigger use of free by adding KOS serialized object to encoding. So once again, OS string will trigger object deallocation. OS data will reallocate the same memory with our attacker-controlled object, with our fake vtable, and we will call just retain on this fake vtable and gaining kernel-level code execution. So after that, Pegasus, after kernel exploitation, Pegasus make a few kernel patches, like set UID to easily escalate privileges, patch out IMFI get out of my way variable to disable IMFI, disable code signature checks by patching CS enforcement disable, and final patch MAC mount and lightweight volume manager to remount system partition as readable writable. After system partition got remounted, we can overwrite with stage 3 loader. And stage 3 loader will download stage 3 files, which contain like 12 files. Most of them are binaries. Here are 3 groups of them. For example, the process group, like double install the watchdog or systemd, which is the main reporting model. More detailed, Andrew will talk more detailed about all these things. There is a dual-lib groups, which, for example, contain lib data. It's mask it and rename it CIDR substrate framework. So Pegasus uses CIDR substrate to inject dialibs into a process and install hooks. And with these hooks, intercept calls, intercept messages, and so on. And finally, a SIR group, which contains com apple iTunes store D file, which is a JavaScript file that uses it for unsighted code execution on device reboot. I will focus on this one. So as I say, it's a JavaScript that triggers a bug that allows to unsigned code execution. In combination with RT-body-D trick, it can be used to achieve a jailbreak persistence. The problem is the bad case in set early value, and fortunately in this case, it's triggerable only from GSC binary process context. So what is the problem? The problem is in set impure getter delegate binding, which is baked by function set impure getter delegate in C++. So what does it do? It get 2 arguments. The first is impure getter, and the second is any JS object that will be set as this impure getter delegate. And it calls a set delegate. What does a set delegate do? It calls set, which call finally a set early value. Here's a problem. Here's a problem in set early value. As we see, there is a reinterpret cast, and there is no type check before this cast, which leads it, if any other object type will be pasted to a function, it will be improperly downcasted to impure getter type. Here's more detailed explanation what happens. Here's the decompiled set, function set impure getter delegate. Most of the methods are inline in here, and as we see, after parsing 2 arguments, it will override base plus 16 with a pointer to a delegate. So basically, we can override one of the object fields with a pointer that we control. On the right, we see JSArrayBufferView class. So if we pass object type JSArrayBufferView, it will override the mVector field with a delegate pointer, which will lead to readable, writable, and even executable primitives. How it can be exploited? First of all, we use a dummy array buffer as a backend vector for 2 data views. And we use a batcast and set impure getter delegate to override one of the fields of first data view with the second data view. And which, as m vector of the first data view is overwritten, we can use set uint or get uint32 to override fields on the second object. What does it give us? We can override the object array buffer address to be 0 and length to be 4 gigabytes and type to be fast array mode. So what just happened? We override data view to make it starting from 0 to map the entire process memory. So basically we can call set or get uint32 to arbitrarily read-write in the entire process. And execution primitive. The same thing can be used, but now we need to call setImpureGetter delegate twice. And instead of exposing the entire process memory, we can leak the object address. If we can leak an object address, we can create a JS function object that will contain hundreds or thousands of empty try-catch blocks, and you start just to execute them. This will lead that JIT will try to compile JavaScript to a native code. For that purpose, readable, writable, executable segment will be allocated. We can leak the address of this readable, writable, executable segment, overwrite it with a shell code, and call to overwrite to execute it. So this is how kernel got re-exploited on each device boot by using the JavaScript. And the very last thing I want to talk is a persistent mechanism. It exploits knowledge that system will launch RT-BDD daemon with early boot argument. And if we can copy the GSC binary from JavaScript core, which is signed by Apple, rename it as RT-BDD, then create a symlink, name it early boot, that will point to JavaScript file that contains a shell code and this badcast. When system starts, it tries to run RT-BDD early boot, and instead it will launch GSC with JS exploit. So this is the persistent tree. And next, I will pass the word to Andrew, who will talk about espionage techniques used in a Pegasus.
Thank you, Max. So we've talked about now the vulnerabilities, how we've jailbroken the device, and now kind of the end result of that is kind of what we saw in stage 3 was essentially the espionage software, the malware payload that actually gets installed. And we talked about there's a lot of services that come down for spawning system services, processes, things like injecting, being able to hook the applications we'll talk about in a moment, and then all of the dynamic libraries as well that are involved to basically hook into the apps to provide hooking. But then let's go into a little bit of the techniques that we found within this espionage software package that's there. So a little bit of things to avoid detection as best they can in analysis. So every time one of those links that we receive that we found, right, got from Citizen Lab or that we discovered through some crawling techniques, they're one-time use links. So once you visit the link, if you try to revisit it again, basically you'll just get redirected to another site. In most cases, it was a redirect for Google for whatever country the site was being served from. In other cases, it was other random news sites and things like that that were happening. So that kind of defeats a little bit of trying to go back if you missed capturing the first set of the payload in the first stage. Additional things we notice, obviously, within the different stages. The first stage, obviously, is a JavaScript exploit because it comes down through the website link that gets run through Safari. That JavaScript was heavily obfuscated. If we initially looked at it, it took about a day to look at what was going on. It took a few more days actually to really dissect the different pieces that was going on and learning about what was happening. In addition, the other pieces of code, like the Objective-C code that's been in there as well, all heavily obfuscated, all hiding common identifiers and things that you would try to figure out easily what's going on with that. Additionally, there were other things that were going on with the payloads that came down. So for example, stage 2 comes down as a compressed payload, but then stage 2 actually, funny enough, contains an encryption key which is used to decrypt the stage 3, which is the encrypted payload that that Max talked about as well. And actually, funny enough, with the actual password, the encryption key, that key actually rotates every time you visit a new link. That's a different key every single time. So they are rotating the key in every single sample that comes through that. And then finally, the spyware components, as we talked about, and as Max alluded to as well, with like the RT-BDD, the processes and application binaries are all hidden to look like system services, so that if you were able to stat some of these files and look at them, you wouldn't really see much difference going on from a base system. So some of the techniques additionally we saw on the device actually to avoid staying undetectable. There was code in there that actually would go through and turn off the ability for the iOS system to actually go ahead and update. So if a new iOS version came down, it could prevent that from actually happening so that it can continue its persistence on the device. Additional things like we saw in the initial video, which is it would clear mobile Safari's history and caches so that as we opened it back up, there's no indication of where you went or what happened. So you really wouldn't be able to revisit the link at all of what's going on with that. And additionally, most of the communications were going over the SIP protocol as well. And then one of the things that was discovered, there's a separate module, obviously, for all the SIP communications, as well as the root CA cert in order to communicate with that server correctly. And then finally, there was actually a variety of different self-destruct mechanisms that are involved with this, right? So there's, within the payloads, there's the ability to erase itself from the device remotely. So if something gets discovered or they want to terminate spying on a device, they can remotely destruct it and Pegasus will remove itself. In addition to that, there was actually mechanisms where if you were to infect a device with Pegasus via Trident, and the device doesn't actually able to check back in with the command and control servers within about 24 hours, it actually will actively remove itself from the device as well, even without having talked to the server. So there is kind of a check-in system that goes on with that, which is fairly interesting. Now, in terms of the actual data that we saw it's able to actually gather and stuff like that, right? Obviously, this is a lot of stuff that you'd expect espionage software to track down. But what we saw basically was the ability to turn on and record the microphone at any point in time. And additionally, any sort of video or data, or any video coming from the camera, obviously, it could record as well and send up to the command and control servers. It collects information like the SIM card you're using and what sort of cell network you're on to kind of identify you and track you, as well as your actual physical location when it can turn the GPS location on. And then also finally, what was interesting was it will go into your iOS keychain and try to get out your password for your Wi-Fi network that you've connected to. So any secure network you've been on, it will pull those credentials out and send them up to the servers as well, for a variety of different reasons, right? Because now they'll have credentials to be able to log into your networks from wherever you are, whether they're work, home, or in transit, they'd be able to do that. So in terms of some of the data collection that we talked about in terms of like, we mentioned the term application hooking a lot, right? And as Seth kind of alluded to, typically you can't do this on a non-jailbroken iOS device. The sandbox prevents you from spying on the other applications in the system. However, once you get a jailbroken device though, you can use tools like Cydia Substrate to essentially what's called hook the application's functions in the thing. So if they have a function that's like send or read messages, you can hook that with the spyware and then basically be able to see and get all that information that's coming down from the framework layer and deliver it off to wherever you want, basically your systems, or basically act on that data as it's happening. So for example, if you have apps that are using end-to-end encryption, at some point that data has to be decoded for you to view it on your phone. The malware will hook that process where it's actually shown, and then they can get the plain text out without having to worry about the encryption piece. That's all done through the Cydia Substrate libraries that we discovered. And that's kind of at a high level what it looks like. Typically, you wouldn't have the big red Pegasus block there, but once it's in, everything kind of filters through for the apps that they've chosen to filter and hook through. They can all filter it, look at every single function, and go from there. And we discovered a lot of different apps that were out there. And the way we did this was we were looking through the code and all the binaries and samples, and there's a large table of exported functions when we were looking through it. And that list basically lists every single application that they've written a hook or some sort of method for in order to tackle. And it covers kind of the common ones that you'd find out there. Additionally, what we discovered is that the spyware malware could be packaged in a way where if depending on where you want to target, different dilibs for the app hooking could be functions. So for example, on the earlier slides, we had one that came down with Viber modules, WhatsApp modules, and I believe another one for some data collection as well for some apps. But within looking at the other kind of function hooks and stuff, there's lots of different export functions for hooking the variety of different messages that are out there as well, or applications out there as well. So it's a very extensive list. And all it takes is another analyst to go and add more hooks and functions to further enhance the malware out there. Now, to provide a little bit of historical context in terms of why this is incredibly interesting and why I believe it got a lot of news was that, typically, there's been very few remote jailbreaks that have been made public out there that really require almost 0 to 1 single-click user interaction, right? This was simply just send a link, they click on the link, and the device is exploited. The last similar one that was actually public was probably about a jailbreak called Jailbreak Me, version 3 actually, where you would just go to a website, jailbreak.me, and it would use a PDF or a font exploit in order to jailbreak the device remotely. But in that case, that was a public jailbreak. The user opted in to jailbreaking their device. In this case, this remotely jailbreaks your device without actually accepting that you want this to happen, essentially. And also additionally, with some of the bugs, as Max explained as well, is that they can be triggered from an app sandbox as well. So while the method of delivery in this case was easier to do through just an SMS text message or via social networks, for clicking on the link. If you were to get a malicious application installed on the device, it could also exploit these vulnerabilities before they got patched and go through the process as well. And so kind of the term, finish up with a little bit of the work and observations that have been going on is, remote jailbreaks in the public are extremely rare. Obviously, 5 years ago was the last time we found it. But this is another one. It's always believed that they were out there in the private, and this kind of just proves the case that they are there. Additionally, it's rarer to find kind of this highly engineered piece of spyware malware that we found. In terms of the comprehensiveness of the hooks that were there, the testing process, all the different features in terms of the hide its tracks, obfuscate, encrypt the different payloads, cycling through single-use links and stuff like that. Very highly advanced of a very good piece of software that exists there. And this to kind of differentiate this between this is commercially developed versus stuff that's kind of homegrown on the side, whereas there's a lot of extra effort that was put into building this sort of stuff as well. And then we're continuing to hunt down other sorts of products like this as well out in the ecosystem using a variety of different data and sensor networks that we have out there. And finally, I want to give thanks to all the people that were involved in this. It wasn't just the three of us. It was actually a lot of collaboration with the Citizen Lab team out there. We had a large team at Lookout that involved all those different binaries that we showed. Everything had to be reverse engineered and understood. So we had our entire team jump on board with that, which is great. We had a couple different outside research organizations that helped as well in terms of helping with the technical writing and further understanding of the vulnerability analysis. So that was extremely great. And then finally, a bunch of links that you can get from the slide deck as well. The Citizen Lab blogs that we've talked about, the initial Lookout blog, and then actually last night we published the full technical teardown. It's about 40 plus pages PDF that explains very clear detail how all the vulnerabilities work that Max just explained and all the nuances. So if you're interested in that, you can go and download that PDF as well and get all the details. But with that, well, thank you very much, and we can open it up for questions.
Max got most of the questions.
Well, you might get some.
No. This one near the microphone.
Oh.
One question. You mentioned that SIM card data was used and collected. Did you consider the possibility that this data was used for some network-based attack? Because Kingfisher and hacking teams, they also provide network-related services. So what SIM card data was collected?
Would that help?
Okay, then.
Yeah, so the SIM card data that we believe we collected was kind of what was the SIM operator, where it was from, kind of the country of origin of the operator of the SIM card, and where it was issued, basically. So that could be used for tracking information in their backend at some point. It's an additional piece of information they have, yeah. But we didn't see any notion, at least in the samples that we encountered, for a further network-based attack from that. But at this point, they've already compromised your device, so they can launch whatever attack they want. Is there any other questions? Can't see anybody. Okay. Oh, someone over there.
Hi, I just saw. Did it actually use SIP to exfiltrate the data? Is that what you're saying?
Can you repeat the question?
You said that it used SIP to transport the data.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's using SIP to exfiltrate the data off the device.
Correct, yes.
Huh. So what UDP over sort of 5060?
Sorry.
Port sort of using UDP over port 5060 sort of thing, encrypted or?
It's like they use their own certificate and embed the asterisk for communicating with through a SIP protocol with command control.
Yeah.
Hi, such a serious product probably has an Android support and other platforms, PC maybe. Did you see anything?
Yeah, so they, I mean, if you look in the reports, actually, they market additional products for Android and BlackBerry as well. This study that we did was strictly the iOS related piece, but we do know that there's an Android product out there as well, for sure. Okay.
Yeah, if there are more, you guys just can catch us. We'll be around today.
Oh, I forgot one more.
Perfect.
What did you get from the SIM? What data?
From SIM? Yes. It's Andrew answered like the operator details. Like we see they trying to capture like IMA stuff, like all the things that the phone used to communicate with the network. like, as well as all the SIM details that are available to iOS.
So basically, their goal is to get as much information about the target as possible, right? So SIM card is just one information of, what carriers they're operating on, where the device is, any sort of information they can get in terms of that. And then they can use that. Once they have the information, then it's a matter of whoever's using the product, how they want to use the information once it's been received. So it's just another piece of information gathering.
Yeah, there are more details in a report, like what fields from a SIM information they're reading and using.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.